Hello everyone, I'm your host Palani Ram, and I take great pride in welcoming you all to my very first podcast, Spying a Bird, a show about bird conservation, bird watching, wildlife rehabilitation, and anything and everything related to birds and nature. So let's jump right into it. To tell briefly about myself, I am a filmmaking student at the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, India, and this podcast came into being while I was making my documentary project. This short documentary that I was making was about a bird hospital curator and an avian veterinarian who go bird watching regularly to learn about the birds in their city. And when the birds get injured or orphaned and are brought back to their hospital, they use their acquired knowledge to treat the ailing birds and care for them until they are ready to be released back into the wild. I conducted this interview with one of the subjects of my documentary, Mr. Sherwin Everett, who's the bird hospital curator at Jivdaya Charitable Trust in Ahmedabad city. This was done as part of my research work, and I've compiled the excerpts of my conversation with him into a light-hearted and hopefully a somewhat educational podcast. Hi Sherwin, can you introduce yourself to the listeners?
My name is Sherwin Everett, and I'm currently working as a wildlife rehabilitator and a conservationist. And I've been doing this since the last 13 years.
Can you tell us about the place you work?
So our hospital, the place where I'm working is an animal and a bird hospital. There's two parts of it. And I mainly handle the birds in the wildlife section. So there we have rescuers bringing birds from all over Ahmedabad city. So far we have recorded 150 species of birds at our trust. And we serve as a hospital. Also, the main goal is to release the birds back into the wild post-treatment. So ultimately, our end goal is always setting them free, right? Setting the bird back into the ecosystem.
And what entails your job as a bird hospital curator?
That entails a lot of care, patience, and discipline, because you have to have a proper knowledge of the bird as well, how to feed it, how to keep it in a proper size cage, what all size of an enclosure it needs, and apart from that, a knowledge of the basic behavior of the bird.
When I was at your hospital, I saw that a large chunk of your work was with baby birds, right? Can you tell us what that is like?
So that's a lot like taking care of a human baby as well. Basically, you need to be alert and active throughout. They need feeds every few hours. The diet has to be proper. Except in the case of a bird, the diet, if it's not the correct nutrition that the bird's proper diet it consumes in the wild, then they start getting a whole range of metabolic issues and health issues. The issue with baby birds is when you're hand raising them, they tend to get used to you and used to a human being feeding them rather than a parent bird. And that's not a good thing actually. So it's called imprinting. And the bird shouldn't imprint onto you. The thing about imprinting then is the bird fails to see itself as the species of bird that it is. The bird in fact thinks it's a human being or associates more with us. For example, like a baby parakeet that we've been hand raising, and if it's a single chick, then it becomes a bit more tedious because you have to be more careful when hand raising a single chick, whereas raising them in a group, it's much more easier because they have the sibling rivalry that they do. They have the company of the other babies. And that doesn't make them completely latch on to only a single person. And the ultimate thing is when we release the bird back into the wild, it should have a good, healthy fear of human beings. Because if I've raised a baby parakeet and I release it back to the wild, but that bird is still used to being with human beings, it'll go out into the wild, but then that bird will also go to another person who then may catch it and put it in a tiny cage, which then defeats the purpose of our entire process of hand raising the bird and going through so many months of raising the bird to fly back into the wild.
A lot of baby birds you get are abandoned or orphaned babies. And I ask, out of the lack of knowledge, why do parent birds abandon their babies?
No, the parents bird don't always abandon the chick. See, the thing is, there is some external factor creating pressure on them, forcing them to abandon the chicks. For example, let's say the branch is cut, the nest has fallen down on the ground. The parent wants to feed the babies, they want to take care of the babies, but because the nest is gone, they have no other option but to leave the babies and go off. The thing is, in nature, it's a very simple policy that they follow. If the parents survive, they can re-nest again and have the offspring again throughout the years. If the baby survives, there is little or no chance of the baby's survival. Whereas the parents, if they survive, they know that they can always reproduce more young every year. So it's more key for the parents to survive rather than the babies at one point of time also. But then there are a lot of other birds that will go an extra mile to protect their babies as well. Crows, for example. If a baby crow is fallen on the ground and anybody wants to go and rescue it or something, they have to make sure that they're wearing a cap or a helmet at least, because the crow has got backup. There's 30, 40 crows in the nearby area will just gather and then mob you because they think you're trying to attack their baby.
Correct. On a corollary note, so what if a bird is injured? Like, what's the big deal?
Bird injuries, they may not play a major role as an individual level, but definitely a species or a flock of birds could have a chance of maybe getting an infection from a certain sick bird as well. Second thing, when we talk about injuries and the importance of birds, you have to see a larger picture where the birds are actually key indicators of an ecosystem. All right. For example, there's a higher level of pollution in the air, and that is not there in the past few years. We may have a higher amount of birds coming in with anthracosis or respiratory infections, and that is due to the environment that they are in. Those birds tell us that that environment is severely polluted. And that gives us an idea to the rising and the current scenario where we human beings could also be next in line.
Speaking of the ecosystem, you have a variety of birds at your hospital at any given point of time. Can you tell us about some major species of birds that get injured? And do they all need to be taken critically and with like a similar sense of alarm?
Certain species of birds are much more important than the others, as you may say. Pigeons, for example, are invasive species, not very important to the ecosystem in the sense where they're not pollinators, they're not fruit eating and dispensers, but birds like parakeets and koyals and all that eat seeds and fruits, and when they pass those seeds out, they help create microforests actually, or little habitats, because of the dispensers that they've become. The other key species are vultures. Vultures and kites are the scavengers. Their importance is very crucial in the ecosystem, but we fail to see that because today we have our corporations, so we don't get to see the dirt lying out. It's all taken and dumped at a particular spot. So that is taken out of our view frame, so we are fine with it. Whereas those birds help clean up the ecosystem that way. And if those species start declining, then it creates a massive problem for the entire ecosystem, even including human health as well. There could be a higher amount of dogs taking the place. There could be a higher amount of flies due to the rotting meat that is there. So overall, it needs to be always taken into consideration as to the major cause to that, as a why. Why is this bird coming in? Or why are these species getting injured? Or why are these species dying in this manner? Why those birds are getting displaced? Why are they coming into captivity? Those are the questions raised. And then researchers or bird watchers or veterinarians, who is interested in that, can take that up and see why this problem is occurring and what's the reason due to this.
What's a current threat that is affecting birds? Like anything particular that you noticed in the birds that you get at the hospital?
In an urban setting, birds have a lot more different threats because we are thinking of our own benefits. So a lot of birds face secondary poisoning. That could be due to rat poison that is there in the raptors like kites, shikaras, owls. And the other secondary poisoning is organophosphate poisoning, pesticide poisoning, which is all commonly found in birds like peacocks and other ground-dwelling birds who eat a lot of the insects or the grain that may have been sprayed with that pesticide.
Wait, can you explain a bit more about rat poison as a threat?
So people feel that rat poisons are a much more effective way of killing the rat or the mouse that is in the house. So what they tend to do is they put the cake of the rat poison in the house, but very often that rat doesn't just die there. So that rat will escape, go back outside the house, and then it gets lethargic, dull, and then that becomes easy prey for a scavenger or for a hunter like a shikara or an owl. And let's say a barn owl gets that rat afterwards, since it's not going to run away as easily. That rat is then consumed by that barn owl. That poison is then shifted into the barn owl system, and then that bird collapses due to that.
What do you think we can do better? How can we make a positive change for the birds?
A simple example as to what you can do better to have a better ecosystem around your house or help your birds and animals around you would be planting native fruiting trees and flowering trees. The current scenario is we want a lavish garden with a lovely, green trees and all that's throughout the year it's green. And then what they tend to do is they tend to go for exotic plants. Those plants don't have any real role in nature. It is just there. And for human, that works as a placebo. We have a green garden, we're very happy, and we have no idea what it's happening. So it's always better to plant native trees and shrubs and bushes and flowering plants. So then you have butterflies, you have birds coming to your garden. So as a human being, that's the best thing we can do for them. The current problem that we are having overall due to development, we are not following a green development pattern, which we should. India, as a developing country, has a lot of scope to overtake and to improve itself than the so-called developed countries. Because those have attained the title of developed, they can do hardly much more further. Here, India has a scope of growing further and beyond. The other thing with us is we are very attuned with nature. We have a lot of animals, birds roaming around our streets, around our houses, and that can be used to our benefit as well. Right now, we are having problems with the temperature. Again, if we have large trees where the trunk size itself is over a few feet, we should try and preserve those trees as much as possible because it takes 50 to 100 years for that tree to reach that size. Also, the amount of carbon that these trees process is massive. It's basically like asking a little kid to do an adult's work. So if you say you're cutting down a large tree and you're planting 10 more saplings, that doesn't make any difference.
In the short documentary that we made, bird watching plays a big part in your role as a bird conservationist. You identify yourself as an avid birder too. How does bird watching help you?
Bird watching or even just studying the basic behavior of birds is very important for us and for me personally as well, because as a wildlife rehabilitator, it helps me facilitate the birds in captivity better. So what we then look for is we see the basic behavior of that particular bird in the wild. For example, if you take birds like flamingos, I would look to see how the flamingo would feed. Flamingos are inverted feeders. They don't feed directly as a normal bird would. The entire head needs to be upside down in the water for the bird to feed normally. They are also filter feeders. Their beaks are built like a sieve and they will feed only on really, really tiny and minute particles. Flamingos, when they need to feed at the bottom, will disturb the silt and they feed in very shallow waters. So they disturb the silt and then they filter feed through it. So if you look at the bird, it looks like it's tap dancing in the water. Now, if I get a flamingo in captivity, I need to know the basic behavior of that bird. Or otherwise, I may create a more difficult position for that bird. Because I think that why is it not eating straight? Why is the bird turning its head upside down? It has an issue. But that's not true. The bird in its normal behavior feeds that way. But that I would only realize it is if I'm observing birds in the wild. Other than that, we also look for the different behaviors that the birds have. Some might be more territorial, some are more social, some prefer to be in isolation. For example, if I have a raptor who is more social, then I need to keep that raptor with birds of similar species in captivity. And yet, if I have a raptor who lives a solitary lifestyle, keeping two of them may result in a fight in the cage and one bird dying or getting injured worse.
Birdwatching as an activity sounds fascinating. I'm pretty sure it has a learning curve as well. How does one get into it? For example, if I wanted to start birdwatching, where should I start?
For any bird watcher who is now getting into the details, it's endless. You start basically by just observing birds around you. You don't need to go to a sanctuary and you don't need to have binoculars. You don't need to have a really large telephoto lens to be a bird watcher. That's again a photographer, by the way, not just a bird watcher. An ideal bird watcher has a binoculars or a spotting scope and a guidebook. That's it. That's the two things that they mainly need. And that's it. We don't need anything more. And of course, the patience. You need a lot of patience while bird watching. You can observe the feet and the beaks and the colors of the plumage. So that helps you identify and differentiate between the species. For example, you'd like a crow. So you see the crow's got, it's a black bird, a medium-sized bird, but it has a big beak, a heavy beak. So that tells you that that bird is a predator, a scavenger. It eats non-veg, it eats rotting food, and it helps clean up the ecosystem. The feet are also gripping feet. They have the feet that are meant for perching birds. And if you compare that to a duck has a flat bill meant for foraging in water and seeds in the water, and it has webbed feet because webbed feet help it to swim. So that's how you start differentiating between birds. And then once you're hooked onto it, then it keeps getting more and more interesting. Once you start with the birds' plumages, as I said, the colors, the different kinds of feathers that they have, and then you go on to the behavior, then you go on to the nesting behavior, the feeding behavior, the basic psychology that the bird follows, territorial display, territorial disputes. Even that in certain species is quite interesting to watch. Birds like common miners, when they fight, they tend to lock talons and then they fall down onto the ground, and they are that engrossed in fighting each other that you can go and pick up those two birds when they're fighting because they're hell-bent on each other. They don't really look at what's around them. And they'll have spectators, whereas other miners are sitting and, provoking them more to keep on fighting. So it's like our human beings, we'll have somebody having an accident in the middle of the road. You have the people gathering. Some will be just spectators. Others will be actually egging them on. So it's very similar to that.